He once bragged about running up the body count like it was a contest, leaving people laid out on Florida streets. Stories like his echo through prison yards, old courtrooms, and the corners where folks whisper about who really caught the most bodies. These aren't the Hollywood gangsters you see in movies. These are the ones who left their names written in obituaries and indictments. Their stories ain't about fame, but about how many lives got erased. Let's trace the streets, the cells, and the blood trails of the killers who left the biggest marks. Timothy Joseph McGee grew up in Atwater Village, a small neighborhood in northeast Los Angeles surrounded by violence. Atwater had a heavy mix of working-class Black and Latino families, but it was also home to one of the city's deadliest gangs, the Toonerville Crips. This clique had roots going back to the 1950s, but by the time McGee came of age in the 1990s, it had evolved into one of the most ruthless offshoots of the Southside Crips. Life in Atwater was shaped by gang colors, drive-bys, and the constant sound of sirens echoing through the blocks. McGee stood out early, not just as another member, but as someone different, someone who seemed addicted to killing. Detectives later described him as a man who treated murder like a sport, calling him a thrill killer. He wasn't hunting for money or revenge alone. He was hunting for the feeling, like he was chasing some rush. By the late 1990s, stories about him were spreading across Los Angeles. Police and locals whispered that Monster didn't just shoot rivals, he stalked them, sometimes taking out innocent bystanders just because they crossed his path. By the time the authorities caught up with his trail, they tied him directly to at least 9 killings, though whispers on the street claimed his real number was much higher. The bodies included gang rivals, informants, and regular citizens who just ended up in the wrong place. One story even linked him to the execution-style murder of a homeless witness who might have spoken to police. He got convicted on 3 counts of murder, but prosecutors believed he pulled the trigger many more times than that. Police records from those years paint him as someone completely without remorse. Officers testified in court about how he smiled after shootouts like he was enjoying the aftermath. Investigators even found notebooks where McGee scribbled violent lyrics and raps, talking about screams in his dreams and the pleasure he felt from bloodshed. In the courtroom, prosecutors compared him not just to a gang leader, but to a serial killer who simply enjoyed watching people die. McGee's reckless nature didn't just put rivals at risk, he even went after law enforcement. In one notorious incident, he opened fire on 2 plainclothes LAPD officers investigating the Toonerville gang. The officers barely escaped, and that ambush elevated his profile from a dangerous gangster to one of the most wanted men in America. Detectives began calling him one of the most feared gang members Los Angeles had ever seen. His violent streak eventually brought the hammer down. In 2003, after years of dodging cases, a nationwide manhunt tracked him down. The capture of McGee was blasted across news stations, with officials saying he was one of the country's most wanted fugitives at that time. His arrest marked the end of a bloody chapter for Atwater Village, but it didn't erase the terror he left behind. The trial only added to his reputation. He sat in court facing prosecutors who laid out every gruesome detail, while jurors saw photos of the victims and read through his chilling writings. McGee smirked and grinned through parts of the testimony, as if the deaths were nothing to him. His conviction came with a death sentence in 2009, though the ruling was later overturned on appeal. Even behind bars, his name carried weight, as he was linked to prison riots and assaults on guards, showing he never really slowed down. Monster McGee's story left a complicated legacy. In the streets, some viewed him as a ruthless villain, while others treated him like some twisted legend of outlaw cool. In reality, he was both feared and despised, a man whose violence destroyed lives and stained a neighborhood with trauma. When police and crime writers today talk about Los Angeles gang brutality in the 1990s and early 2000s, his name always comes up. Timothy McGee became the face of thrill killing, someone who proved that for certain men in the gang world, murder was more than survival, it was entertainment. Stanley Williams was born in December 1953 in New Orleans before moving with his mother to Los Angeles. He grew up in South Central, where gangs were beginning to shape neighborhoods block by block. In the early 1970s, Williams linked up with Raymond Washington, another young hustler with big influence. Together, they started what became one of the most powerful street gangs in America, the Crips. This set quickly spread across Los Angeles and then across the entire country, marking a new level of organized street life. Williams gained his reputation through sheer physical power and raw presence in the streets. People described him as built like a tank with arms that made him feared during fights. His role in the Crips gave him a level of authority, and he walked through neighborhoods as a symbol of the gang's strength. While Raymond Washington was seen as the brains, Williams became known as the muscle, the one who made fear a tool. He embodied the idea that the Crips were not just a group, but a force willing to do anything. By 1979, Williams was facing charges that would define the rest of his life. That year, he was convicted for 4 murders that shocked Los Angeles. The first victim was Albert Owens, a young clerk working at a 7-Eleven store. According to prosecutors, Williams walked in with a shotgun and fired 2 blasts into Owens. Just days later, he killed 3 members of a motel-owning family named the Yangs. Court records showed he executed them with multiple shotgun rounds, leaving a horrific scene. Witnesses testified that Williams later bragged about the killings, calling his victims Buddha heads. The case against Williams relied on both forensic evidence and testimony from associates. His shotgun was matched to the shells found at the murder scenes. Accomplices described him laughing about the crimes, saying he fired without hesitation. The jury had little doubt, and in 1981, he was sentenced to death in California. This conviction put one of Los Angeles' most infamous gang leaders on San Quentin's death row, where he would remain for decades. Inside prison, Williams slowly shifted his public image. Over the years, he began writing children's books that warned about the dangers of gangs. These writings, along with recorded interviews, turned him into a controversial figure. He claimed to be a changed man, someone who wanted peace between the Crips and the Bloods. He even drafted a peace protocol that called for unity between rival gangs in Los Angeles. Supporters pointed to his influence on younger generations as proof that redemption was possible, even for someone with his past. The media took notice, and soon Williams had celebrity backing. Rapper Snoop Dogg, actor Mike Farrell, and even Jamie Foxx campaigned for him. He was nominated several times for the Nobel Peace Prize, though those nominations were mostly symbolic. MTV aired pieces about him, and activists demanded clemency from California's governor. Williams became the center of a national debate about justice, redemption, and whether a killer could change his ways. But prosecutors and victims' families rejected these claims completely. They reminded the public of the 12 shotgun blasts that tore through innocent lives in 1979. Court documents detailed every wound and every death, and families of the Yangs refused to forgive. The Los Angeles Times ran graphic descriptions of the killings that left a permanent mark on readers. To them, Williams was not a peacemaker, but a man who had executed 4 innocent people. They viewed his campaign as nothing more than manipulation. In December 2005, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger denied Williams clemency after reviewing the case. On December 13, 2005, Stanley "Tookie" Williams was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin. Outside the prison, protests and vigils showed how divided the public had become. Some called him a redeemed leader. Others remembered him as nothing more than a murderer. His life ended with the same complexity that marked his legacy, a mixture of bloodshed and attempted reform. By the mid-2010s, the gang known as MS-13 had already built a reputation for violence across the United States. The Mara Salvatrucha gang, originally from El Salvador, planted roots in Long Island suburbs like Brentwood and Central Islip. Out of that expansion came Alexi Saenz, a young shot caller who rose to power quickly. Born in 1994, he became known for commanding brutal acts that shocked the quiet neighborhoods of Suffolk County. In 2016, Saenz was tied to one of the most notorious murders in Long Island history. 2 teenage girls, Nisa Mickens, age 15, and Kayla Cuevas, age 16, were found beaten and hacked to death. Prosecutors said Saenz approved and ordered the killings after the girls clashed with MS-13 members. Court documents describe the murders as torture, with bats and machetes used to carry out the attack. These killings drew national outrage, and suddenly Saenz's name was being spoken across the country. Authorities linked Saenz to at least 8 murders between 2015 and 2016. Victims included suspected rivals, defectors, and anyone the gang wanted gone. The Justice Department labeled him a high-ranking leader of the Brentwood clique. Investigators intercepted his communications, finding him personally approving hits on young targets. Family members of the victims filled courtrooms wearing shirts with photos of their loved ones. The killings turned Suffolk County into a stage for America's larger fears about immigration and gang violence. The national spotlight intensified when President Donald Trump visited Long Island in 2017. During speeches, Trump used the murders of Mickens and Cuevas as proof of MS-13's brutality. He called for tougher laws and even suggested the death penalty for leaders like Saenz. Media outlets across the country branded Saenz as a monster, with headlines describing him as the face of MS-13 terror. The case became political, with Saenz turned into a symbol of immigrant gang violence in the suburbs. In July 2025, Saenz finally stood in court to face his crimes. Federal prosecutors announced that he had reached a plea agreement admitting to ordering or approving 8 murders. The agreement avoided a death penalty trial, but sentenced him to 68 years in prison. Families of the victims testified about their pain, while Saenz gave a short apology. Prosecutors responded that his actions spoke louder than his words, describing his rule as a reign of terror. For Long Island residents, the name Alexi Saenz will always carry memories of fear and tragedy. The killings of Mickens and Cuevas became symbols of innocence lost, while the other victims represented a community under siege. Saenz's story became more than just a criminal case. It became a warning about how violent gangs can thrive even in quiet suburbs. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars, remembered not for leadership, but for lives destroyed. From New York to Los Angeles, the names echo. But even in Florida, a young Crip member wrote his name in blood. James Herard came out of Lauderhill, a city north of Fort Lauderdale, where smaller sets claimed Crip colors and followed their own rules. Born in 1986, Herard was described as a tall and thin figure with a quiet presence until the killings began. He joined up with local Crip associates in the mid-2000s, just as Broward County was struggling with new waves of gang activity. Police said that Herard became the second in command of a crew that wanted to make headlines through pure body counts. In 2008, prosecutors said Herard and 2 of his boys went out with a twisted challenge. They called it a body count competition, like they wanted to see who could stack the most bodies. One of their victims was Eric Jean-Pierre, a man just walking home when the crew rolled by. Herard was accused of urging his friend to shoot, and court records said he told him afterward that there would be no more witnesses. Another killing that same year was Kim Huynh, a victim tied to the spree by ballistic evidence. Police later said that Herard's group treated random residents like targets in a video game, rolling through neighborhoods with guns ready. Detectives recovered the 9mm pistol used in the Jean-Pierre killing and traced it back to Herard's crew. They also found the getaway car, which carried shell casings and other evidence. Witnesses from the neighborhood testified that the group bragged about the shootings after the fact. Prosecutors built a case that showed Herard not just as a participant, but as a leader encouraging violence. They stacked charges, presenting the spree as calculated cruelty rather than chaotic crime. Herard was hit with 18 counts in total, including 2 murders, attempted murders, and robberies. The jury found him guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death for the killing of Eric Jean-Pierre. For the Huynh case, he was given life, showing how prosecutors wanted him off the streets forever. Florida's Supreme Court later upheld his convictions, calling the crimes cold and senseless. Court opinions said that Herard and his friends went out driving, specifically looking for people to kill. Neighbors in Lauderhill told reporters that the killing spread fear across blocks that already faced drug trade problems. Many said the worst part was that victims were not rivals or hustlers, but innocent folks. Rumors spread that Herard's group might have been tied to other unsolved shootings, but prosecutors never brought those charges. The image of a gang rolling around with a kill competition stuck in Florida headlines for years. Judges, prosecutors, and residents alike used his name as a warning about gang violence infecting suburban spaces. Herard never became a national headline like leaders in Los Angeles or Chicago, but in Broward County, his name became infamous. Reporters described him as remorseless, while officers spoke about how he laughed in interrogations. His legacy is remembered as the most senseless kind of gang killing, where death was treated like a game. When Los Angeles detectives talk about the most feared names of the crack era, Cleman Johnson always comes up first. Born in 1968, Johnson grew up in South Central during a time when the streets were overflowing with blood and Crip sets. He linked himself to the 89 family Swan Bloods, a clique known for pushing violence as a way to claim territory. By the late 80s and early 90s, Johnson had risen into leadership, building a reputation for ruthless attacks on rivals. His nickname, Big Evil, was no accident. It was earned through fear and bloodshed. In 1991, prosecutors charged Johnson in connection with the slayings of 5 people. Among those victims was an off-duty police officer who got caught outside a car wash in South Los Angeles. Detectives said Johnson and his crew targeted not just rivals, but anyone who stood in their way. The killings were carried out with pump-action shotguns and automatic weapons, leaving bodies across South LA neighborhoods already buried under the weight of crack cocaine wars. Prosecutors painted him as a stone-cold killer who used violence to cement his crew's reputation. Johnson eventually landed on death row for 2 of the killings. For years, he sat in prison while appeals wound their way through California courts. Inmates remembered him as a presence who still carried weight inside prison yards. Even as years passed, detectives told reporters that his name carried a level of fear. Street stories described him laughing after shootings, almost like death was entertainment. Former gang members from South LA told the Los Angeles Times that Johnson was someone you never crossed, even from behind bars. His prison life stretched on for decades, but new rulings and technical issues changed his fate. Prosecutors faced problems during retrials, and one judge even cited misconduct by detectives. In 2023, Johnson quietly entered a plea deal on a single murder count, and the other charges were dropped. The plea shocked many in Los Angeles, who remembered him as a figure tied to multiple bodies. The agreement meant he would eventually face parole hearings after decades inside, though victims' families strongly opposed it. The street image of Cleman Johnson remains powerful even now. His nickname, Big Evil, is repeated in documentaries and gang reports as the definition of what terror looked like in the 1990s. People in South Central who lived through that time recall how even saying his name brought silence. His reputation stood alongside other infamous Los Angeles killers who terrorized blocks from Florence to Watts. The media lens on Johnson shifted after the plea deal. Reporters described him as an older man at 55, facing possible parole rather than death row. Coverage debated whether rehabilitation was even possible for someone with his record. Some journalists pointed out that his case reflected racial tensions in Los Angeles courts, since detectives were exposed for racist behavior in earlier trials. Others still reminded the public of the bodies from 1991, calling him one of the most notorious Bloods in history. Cleman, Big Evil Johnson, remains remembered as a feared Blood from South LA. His story shows how one man's violence could brand an entire clique with terror for generations. Even after decades behind bars, his name continues to represent the darkest years of Los Angeles street wars. From the streets of Los Angeles and Florida, the trail of bodies stretches west into Nevada, where Joel Vargas Escobar rose. Known on the streets as Momia, he became one of the most feared names linked to MS-13 in the western states. Vargas Escobar was a U.S.-born Salvadoran who grew up between Nevada and California before falling deeper into Mara Salvatrucha cliques. He rose quickly through the Parkview set of MS-13, running operations that spread violence from Las Vegas into California neighborhoods. By 2018, law enforcement said he was directing a string of murders that shocked the region. The Parkview clique under Vargas Escobar was accused of at least 11 killings across Nevada and California in 1 year. These were not quick shootings alone, but torture murders meant to send a message of power. Court filings describe victims being tied to trees in the desert and stabbed repeatedly until lifeless. Other victims were shot in canyons and left in remote areas, with bodies recovered days later. Some were kidnapped, beaten, and executed in front of gang members to prove loyalty. Prosecutors said Vargas Escobar personally approved the murders, assigning crews and sometimes listening in over radio during attacks. The brutality of the crimes brought national attention from the Department of Justice. Officials branded Vargas Escobar a terrorist, language usually reserved for international figures. FBI Director Kash Patel called him a dangerous mastermind who used military-style command to control his clique. Attorney General Bondi described him as orchestrating terror through 11 brutal killings tied directly to MS-13. Law enforcement warned the public that his clique had evolved into something closer to a paramilitary unit than a street gang. Despite being deported to El Salvador in 2018, Vargas Escobar returned illegally to the United States. Authorities said he slipped back into Las Vegas and resumed ordering killings almost immediately. His fugitive years included movements through California safe houses and rumored connections with MS-13 cliques in Los Angeles. After years of investigation, federal agents tracked him down in New York in April 2025. The arrest ended a 4-year manhunt that stretched across multiple states. His smiling Facebook photos were shown alongside gruesome images of crime scenes, a chilling reminder of double lives. On the streets, Vargas Escobar's name was compared to mafia bosses. Other MS-13 members spoke of him as a figure who commanded fear even across state lines. Community members in Las Vegas recalled warnings not to cross Parkview members because Romeo gave orders from the shadows. Reporters covering the story described him as a symbol of how MS-13's reach had spread far from Central America. Court hearings in Nevada now carry his name as shorthand for the terror MS-13 left in the region. From the deserts of Nevada, the story shifts back to Chicago, where Romeo Blackman became a face of modern gang killing. Blackman came out of Inglewood, a South Side neighborhood long scarred by gang wars tied to the gangster disciples. His set, known as the Goonie Gang or Goonie Boss clique, operated with ties to larger GD alliances. By the late 2010s, Blackman was already leading crews that carried out brazen shootings in Inglewood streets. In 2018, federal authorities indicted Blackman along with Terrence Smith and Jalicious Turman on racketeering charges. The case laid out a pattern of murders tied to the Goonies over 2 years. Prosecutors listed at least 6 killings linked directly to Blackman's crew, each one carried out with ruthless intent. Victims included young rivals shot down on open streets and men killed inside neighborhood barbershops. In one case, a teenage boy was shot 28 times in broad daylight. Witness intimidation was also part of their playbook, with residents too scared to testify openly. The Justice Department built its case using social media, intercepted calls, and testimony from insiders. Prosecutors showed videos and posts where Goonie members bragged about stolen guns and violent attacks. Blackman and Smith were called soldiers who kept Inglewood in a state of fear through random shootings. In July 2023, the trial began, with families of victims filling the courtroom. Witnesses described how the Goonies bragged about stealing weapons from police cars and using them in drive-by shootings. By 2025, the verdict came down. Blackman and Smith were convicted of RICO conspiracy and held responsible for multiple murders. Each was sentenced to life in prison, while Turman received 20 years for his role in another killing. Prosecutors told reporters that the sentences finally gave Inglewood residents a measure of safety. The U.S. attorney said directly that neighborhoods had been terrorized and that serious crimes now carried serious consequences. For Inglewood, the name Romeo Blackman became tied to cycles of revenge that gripped Chicago for decades. Older residents saw his case as part of the same pattern that plagued the city since the mid-'80s. Families who lost loved ones remembered him not as a legend, but as the man who kept blood flowing on the streets. Community leaders demanded more patrols and youth programs to break the cycle, but scars remained deep. Blackman's story showed how the Goonie Gang symbolized a new generation of violent cliques in Chicago. His conviction in 2025 closed a chapter, but also reminded the city how quickly gangs replaced fallen leaders. For many residents, his name still echoes with fear, representing the endless cycle of shootings that define Inglewood. From Inglewood's new generation of shooters, the story flows into the man whose name still controls conversations about Chicago gangs. Larry Hoover was born in 1950 and grew up in the rough streets of Chicago's West Side. By the late 1960s, he was already a recognized figure in the Black Gangster Disciples, a set that split from rival crews during that period. Hoover's presence gave the group structure, and soon he rose as national chairman of what became the Gangster Disciples. In 1973, Hoover was arrested for ordering the abduction and murder of a dealer named William Young. He was convicted and given a sentence of 150 to 200 years. The killing cemented his image as ruthless, a leader willing to eliminate anyone who crossed his path. From inside prison walls, Hoover continued to hold influence, giving orders that prosecutors later said resulted in dozens of killings. Rumors in Chicago claimed Hoover's squads carried out executions across the city, though few cases ever reached trial. By the 1980s and 1990s, Hoover had transformed into something more than a street leader. The Gangster Disciples became a national syndicate with drug distribution stretching far beyond Chicago. Law enforcement constantly tied shootings and murders back to his influence, painting him as the architect of gang bloodshed. In 1995, Hoover was indicted again under RICO laws for directing GD activities from his cell. Federal prosecutors accused him of running operations that left neighborhoods flooded with violence and bodies. Despite spending decades behind bars, Hoover's legend grew on the streets. His name was invoked by younger members who claimed loyalty even without meeting him. To the media, he became the face of Chicago's gang crisis, a kingpin whose personal body count was small, but whose influence produced countless deaths. Court records note only 2 confirmed killings tied directly to him, but police often suggested the number of hits ordered under his leadership reached into the hundreds. Today, Hoover remains locked up, his parole requests rejected repeatedly. For Chicago residents, his story symbolizes how one man can shape decades of violence. His myth is now bigger than the confirmed facts, yet his name still represents the shadow of murder in the city. From Chicago's prison legends, we move into the federal system, where Thomas Silverstein became one of the most feared men inside. Born in 1952, Silverstein joined the Aryan Brotherhood while serving earlier sentences. By the early 1980s, he was already recognized as a violent enforcer for the white supremacist prison gang. In 1983, his name became notorious after 3 brutal murders shook the system. That year, Silverstein killed 2 black inmates in separate attacks, both stabbings carried out with prison-made weapons. Later that same year, he murdered correctional officer Merle Klutz at the federal prison in Marion, Illinois. He stabbed the officer repeatedly in a calculated assault that shocked the Bureau of Prisons. After the murder, Silverstein was labeled the most dangerous prisoner in America. Authorities responded by placing him under no human contact status, a form of solitary confinement that lasted decades. Silverstein spent 35 years isolated, longer than any prisoner in U.S. history. He was locked away at facilities like Marion and later the ADX Supermax in Colorado. Officials said he could never be trusted around staff or inmates because his history showed he killed without hesitation. Media reports described Silverstein as a man who embodied prison violence in its purest form. Stories painted him as the executioner of the Aryan Brotherhood, feared even by other killers. Some articles called him the loneliest man in America, highlighting his life in permanent isolation. Letters he wrote from solitary described his suffering, with one statement saying it was more humane to kill a man immediately than bury him alive in a cell. Though his confirmed victims numbered 3, rumors inside the prison system claimed he had many more. Guards and inmates whispered his name like a warning, reminding everyone that he represented unchecked prison power. In 2019, Silverstein died at the age of 67 while still in custody. His story closed with the same violence that defined it, leaving him remembered as the face of Aryan Brotherhood brutality. From Los Angeles thrill killers to Florida body count games, from Long Island shot callers to Chicago kingpins, these names live on. Their stories show how murder became currency in the streets, building legends out of blood and fear. Some chased power, others chased recognition, but all left trails of death that scarred communities. The myths around them often grew larger than the facts, with rumors adding to reputations already cemented in violence. Yet behind every name were real victims, families, and neighborhoods forced to carry the weight. The body counts are more than numbers. They are lives erased forever. In the end, the names of these killers echo not as glory, but as reminders of what violence leaves behind.